It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody tonight to the University of Westminster, to the very eloquently titled Developing the Space for a Public Conversation about Democratic Reform. Whoever thought up that title is very, very snappy. I think University of Westminster is a great place to hold this. 176 years ago, the Polytechnic that was originally here was open to introduce people to new technological developments, and then Quintin Hogg in 1882 to relaunch the Polytechnic with the aim of engaging the wider public in education. I'm at the Centre for the Study of Democracy, so I didn't say who I was. My name is Graham Smith. I'm a professor at the Centre there, and we're really focusing on a number of issues, including the issue of public engagement. And it is a real pleasure to partner tonight with Involve, with Democratise and with the Democratic Society to actually start thinking through what it would mean to engage people in a discussion on democratic reform. For myself, I'm very concerned that this is something that's being discussed by a few think tanks and a few politicians, and I think this is something we really need to open up. But it's a real pleasure to welcome you here. Please, during the evening, help yourself to a bit of some snacks and some drink. But I'm going to hand over to the participation professionals. I'm an academic. There are people in this room who are much better than me who will explain to us why on earth we're sitting in a circle. So but first of all, I'll introduce Amy from Involve, who's going to just give us a bit of background as why we're here.
Thanks very much, Graham. Just to say quickly, housekeeping, you are being webcast, so at the same time relax, but also know that you're being broadcast to the whole wide world. We are going to be writing up a short note from this event and trying to find ways to explore keeping everyone connected and crystallising things outwards, and we'll share that with you afterwards. So just briefly, why are we here? I mean, I can't speak for all of you, but in terms of why Involve and DemSoc and Andy and I started to think about bringing everyone together, we sort of shared a common concern, really, that there could be an elite stitch-up around democratic reform, that, as Graham was saying, that there's been an unprecedented energy coming out of Scotland, but that wasn't being shared in the regions and in the rest of the UK, and that there were an awful lot of really key unanswered questions for our democratic future that were primarily being answered and thought about by the elite communities in Westminster, and not much more broadly amongst the citizens who really need to own them and whose lives they were going to be affecting. So what we're interested in is thinking about how we can create a space and a process for putting citizens and civil society more in the driving seat for that. We don't have a grand plan. We're not coming with sort of 10 preconceived points on constitutional reform and asking you all to get alongside them. What we're interested in doing is fostering spaces and channels for citizens and civil society to lead the conversation about the UK's future and helping them to drive that agenda. But we don't have a kind of pre-formed idea of what that's going to look like. So on that score, we're seeking to work in an agile way, in a kind of creative chaos, positive chaos type of way, more of which later. We're hoping that we'll run a series of events which will build on one another, and that we'll test the energy, test what seems to be working, change our mind, and revise as we go along, and that we'll do all our thinking in open in a transparent way, so that we can really assist that learning and be accountable. And we're hoping that we'll come up today with a sense of who's working on what, who we could work together with, and that we can iterate a plan together, really. Sorry. But just to demonstrate that iterative, creative chaos learning. So yeah, when I say lead, we really mean having a leading voice collectively, and citizens taking a leading voice in that, rather than bring forth leaders. When we talk about mapping the energies and understanding what's going on, we're not trying to assemble everybody in front of a huge grand scheme so that we can sit as generals at the top moving the figures around. We're sort of thinking more about a guerrilla army for democracy, and hope that you'll come around on that journey with us. Anyway, so over to Anthony.
Turn the mute off. Okay, so thank you very much for coming. That's the first thing to say. We're going to run the rest of this session as an open space. So, who's been involved in open space stuff before? A few. Okay, right. Well, let me briefly explain. The purpose of open spaces is not just to reduce the burden on facilitators, although that's good benefit. It is to make sure that the people in the room who have expertise and knowledge are able to share it in an easy way. So what we're going to do is I'm going to ask you in a moment to think about what you would want to talk about. What's the session that you would run? What knowledge do you have that you'd want to share? What ideas do you have that you want to develop? Or what would you like to listen to? So if you have experience from the Scottish referendum of some brilliant activities that went on to get people talking, if you have some thoughts about how you can get some stuff going online, then you want to share, or you want to be part of that conversation, stick your hand up at the end, in a minute, and you'll get a chance to say, this is what I want to talk about. And then we'll form you into groups. We'll probably do about 4 groups for the first half an hour, and then do a different 4 groups for another half an hour, so that people get the chance to go and explore what's what. There are 2 basic rules to open spaces. The first is the law of 2 feet, which is that if you aren't being productive or enjoying where you are, stand up and walk over to a different space, because that's absolutely fine. And the second rule is no tourists. And that means be there and contribute. And if you're not contributing, learn. But don't just be there and check on your email and stuff like that. So, the first thing to say, the most important thing to say about this whole session is that I don't care for the rest of the evening about proportional representation, or about the role of the House of Lords, or about anything to do with the actual destination of constitutional reform. What this session is about is how we get the public involved in talking about whatever it is that they want to see. And whether that's by talking about it as politics, or whether it's by talking about it about democracy, or whether we think that the public really do want to have a mass meeting about, the 1999 House of Lords Reform Act provisions on the Lord Lieutenancy of England, and all of that stuff. We can talk about all of it, but it is about the public conversation. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now to think about if there is a session that you would like to run, if there is something that you would like to hear about, and then in a moment I will ask you to step forward and say that you'd like to talk about X, Y, or Z. So take a couple of minutes to think about what you would like to talk about, what you would like to run. Right, you have a couple of moments. Do feel free to keep writing while the first people talk, but I can see that Simon, for starters, has a suggestion. So, what session would you like to run? Mike? Amy? Someone has Mike.
Oh, sorry.
I should say, by the way, that because we're being webcast, for posterity, you need to have the mic, otherwise posterity will not hear you.
I'm Simon, Director of Involve, and I'm interested in how we make sure that the debates and conversations we manage to spark aren't just happening in rooms that then aren't heard. So my question really is, how do we make the conversations and debates visible, and particularly visible to those in power so they know they have to listen?
Okay. Do you want to be the first to stick that up? Who else would like to talk? Yes. There you go.
Hi, my name is Chrissy Nicholson. I'm a community organiser with the Migrant and Refugee Communities Forum, and I just got some gists, some ideas, some hunches that community organising can help facilitate public engagement. So I have a master's degree in community organising, and recently we brought 12 talented migrant leaders together to discuss the importance of political participation, and then they went out and they registered nearly 5,000 people to vote within their communities, and we're working on this as well in the run-up to the general election. So I'm just thinking about community organising as a way to engage around democracy.
Thank you very much. Could I ask you to take that bit of paper up to Simon, put on the board, but put your name on the bottom so people know who you are who's running that session. Brilliant. Yes?
This is quite a similar session, I suppose, but from a slightly different angle. I'm Jessica Metheringham. I work for the Quakers, and the thing I can offer would be around how we get little groups talking, particularly through the networks which already exist there. So things like churches, things like societies which exist already.
Brilliant. The network of networks. Fantastic. Thank you. So pass that on to Simon with your name on the bottom.
I need these bits of paper.
I'm coming, sorry.
Give me a paper. Thank you, yes.
Hi, I'm Charles Seaford from the Economics Foundation, and I'd like to talk about, but I don't have an answer, I'd like to talk about how we create the link between constitutional issues and issues like jobs, homes and the local community.
Excellent. Sounds great. Thank you. So, Nail and Simon. Who else? Yes.
I'm Ed Cox from IPPR North. I want to talk about how we get the conversation out of London and make sure that it's a properly national conversation.
That sounds like an excellent plan. Yes. Anyone behind me? Yep.
Hello, my name is Antonia. I'm Director for Participation People, and I'd really like to have a conversation about how to involve young people in democratic reform, not just talking about votes at 16.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm from Liverpool, if that helps.
Already outside.
I'd like us to consider how we develop neighbourhood structures and processes that enable people to contribute to policy making where they live.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Sounds great. Who else? Yes.
My name's Maurice Hoffman. I live in Wembley, and I'd like to talk about people power in the NHS.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sounds good. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes, so take it up to Simon. Oh, sorry. There you go.
Hi there, my name's Nick Mahoney. I was wondering what a process might look like that brought together, excuse me, the many different and wide-ranging groups that are already involved in these conversations, be they 38 Degrees or Occupy or UK Uncut or local groups. I think it's similar to something that's already been said.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Who else? Yes.
I'm Mark Kitson from the Institute for Government, but here largely in personal interest. I'm wondering how something like this can work as a kind of leaderless conversation, or if it can't work as a leaderless conversation, who would the leaders be, given that we clearly are trying to take this away from political leaders, but our political leaders will have to adopt it ultimately.
No, that's a very good point. A very good question indeed, in fact. Yeah, anyone else?
Give me that piece of paper.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Mike from Leeds. I'm a northerner. What's the positive impetus for people getting involved in this conversation?
Really good question. Thank you very much indeed. Should I say that? Any more? Oh, yes, right.
I'm Linda, also from Leeds. I'd like to just hear from people who have got real stories of real large-scale public conversations that they've done them in the past, where it's been large-scale, and it might link in with what you were calling around, the other 38 Degrees and Occupy. Yeah. But what works really well?
Okay.
Hi, I'm Peter. I built Vox Hub. I've written down TCP/IP for participation projects. But what I mean is I would like to look at building some kind of open network protocol that sort of breaks down boundaries of electoral geography and like the myriad different projects that are going on. Something really open that allows things to connect together.
That sounds great.
I think I'd like to talk a bit about how we make this focused on democratic reform and not just limited to a sort of elite discussion about constitutional reform.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Thank you for setting nice points. Anyone else? No? Okay, all good. One. Sorry. Simon, are you able to... Are there any that need grouping, or are we... I've tried. If you put them into two streams...
Hello, my name's James Bagley. I'm here representing the Saving Rich Hospital campaign. In our own experience, it'd be interesting to know how non-political groups, I know you mentioned churches, but also in our case it was a lot of sporting groups, all different kinds of community groups that already exist but have no political affiliation can be involved in the conversation.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Anyone else? You're not allowed to propose one because it's all I can't do it, but I can still propose you.
Although I'm actually excluded from running a group, but that's because I have another job to do. I'm Andy Williamson, I'm from Democratise, and I'm a southerner because I come from New Zealand, so that's as far south as you can get. But I grew up in Manchester, so that makes me a northerner as well. And what I'm interested in is how do we involve the people that are really difficult to involve? And I don't just mean the normal hard-to-reach groups, I mean people like young people in care, homeless, travellers, people who are totally excluded from the system. How do we include them?
Yeah, okay, good question. Right. On the assumption that no one has a last-minute inspiration, here's what happens now. Simon, my beautiful assistant, will be turning those into 2 sessions. And we will rearrange our chairs so that we will have, I reckon it's going to be about 12, Simon? 6 in each session? If you think about how they're grouping?
Maybe.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask people to split into the group that they want to go to the group they want to, listen for a bit. If they want to move on, they can move on. There is going to be flip chart paper for each group. Please do take notes because we won't have time at the end for everyone to feedback everything. And we do want to capture the stuff that you're talking about. So if you can ask somebody in your group to take notes, then we will write these things up and we'll share it around everyone so that you can see what happened in the bits that you weren't able to see. Andy is going to be bumblebeeing, as I'm told it's called, from group to group, picking up ideas and taking them from place to place. Yeah, no problem.
I might ask questions.
You might also ask questions. And we're going to do that. We're going to do the first set of groups for half an hour. And then we're going to stop and everyone changes over and we'll do the second set of groups for the next half an hour. And then there will be an opportunity for people to feedback their thoughts, not group by group necessarily, but just generally the things that they picked up from the day. And hopefully by the end, we will have some shared intentions and some ideas that we can take on into some future conversations with people in this room. So, Simon, do you want to take the mic and talk about what ideas we have up there and how we're going to handle each session?
This is going to work really well for the webcasting, sorry.
So I tried to group a couple of them together, and you're more than welcome to rebel and tell me that I've got it wrong. The ones I thought kind of vaguely worked together, potentially, were, Jessica, yours on how to get small group meetings across the UK, so how to get those working together. Potentially connecting with how do we develop neighbourhood structures and processes to enable people to connect. I don't know whether, and that was not named, so I don't know whether you feel that fits together. And then, what would a process be that brought together different groups and organisations and activists already involved in these sorts of conversations? I'm making a big assumption in lumping that together with the other two that they're happening locally. Do those feel like they fit together? The people who presented them rebelling desperately? Okay, good. I'm feeling slightly more nervous about this one. Involving young people in democratic reform, not just votes, with how do we get non-political community groups involved? I'm making a big assumption that young people aren't political. I know that's not true. But I'm wondering whether that kind of, do they fit together nicely or do you want to have them separately? I'm going to take silence as assent. The link between kind of constitution and then issues that people worry about, jobs, homes and so on, I wondered whether that fitted with people power in the NHS as being one of those issues, or whether you see those as being separate. Okay. Community organising as a way, and I kind of thought that sounded to me like it was a bit of lesson learning, and I wondered about putting that together with the other lesson learning around kind of understanding what works for lifestyle conversations, or whether they're totally separate and you want to have them separate, because again you could see that as being lesson learning or as being.
But they come from 2 different traditions, but actually they work really well together. So.
And Linda, are you happy with that as well?
Let's try it, but I really want to call people who've got solid experience into that group to hear what works.
Sure. Okay. And those are the ones that I wanted to pull together. So I think I'm going to have to move, so we've got, I think if we have in the first stream, we have the kind of the lesson learning, community organising and large-scale events. We have how do we make the conversation visible. We have the kind of connecting these issues to real issues that people face. We've got the kind of how do we make this democratic and not just constitutional reform. And we've got the TCP/IP, and I will learn one day what that acronym means, for participation processes, as one set of streams. That's 6, isn't it?
That's the first.
That's the first one.
All right, so stop there. If you didn't hear your idea read out, that means your idea is in the second session.
Exactly.
So in this first session, read me the first group.
Community organising and large learning stories from large-scale processes.
If you propose that, stand up. Okay? Right. Can I ask you to run that session in the audio-visual corner? Over here. Just grab people and chairs and bring them together around here. So just pull them out of the circle and create a mini circle over here.
Right. Do it in just a minute while we get a location. Then,
Second.
around Graham, how do we make this conversation about democracy and not just about constitutional reform?
Right, so that's Graham, just so people can see who it is. And that's going to be in the booze corner. Important, the booze corner.
I knew I should have done myself next. I could have been in the booze corner.
Telecommunications Connection Protocol, Internet Protocol.
Thank you for participation, process. Yes.
Is Peter, and that's going to be in the lectern corner.
How do we make these conversations actually visible?
How do we make the conversation visible?
That's me.
Is you, and we'll put you in the middle here.
I'm always in the middle.
And
then kind of connecting democratic issues and the conversation about democratic reform to issues that matter to people.
Real issues, who proposed that?
Charles and Morris.
Yep, so you're in the obscure dignitary corner. So, I hope you all have... I hope that everyone has something of those 5 that they would like to go to. So can I ask you to stand up and move your chairs and go?
The first question is the question right? So the question is, how do we make these visible? And I just wonder, kind of, do we all understand the same thing by that? What I proposed and what I thought I was proposing, and interested to know whether you agree with the same, is how do we make sure that these aren't conversations going on in rooms that aren't heard by those who think they're making the decisions and think they have the right to have the decisions? So how do we make them visible so that the Westminster elite can't ignore them? That's what I was interested in, but are you all interested in that same question?
Yeah, and I would be interested in going a step further as well and saying not only how can we make these conversations visible so that the right people are hearing them, but also how can we create these conversations and create a momentum behind the conversations that they have to listen and that there's some accountability in it. Do you want me to take notes?
Well, I was about to say, I can't both kind of facilitate and take notes. So, yes, that would be great. I was going to actually do it the other way around, but if you want to do the notes, that would be great. Yes, please. Thank you. So, is that...
I think so, yes. I mean, an idea that I and others have had for many years is the idea of kind of potentially big open space or big inclusive conversations in the heart of Leeds, and that's just where I'm based, that would be making it visible, maybe not to Westminster, but certainly visible to the kind of political establishment in Leeds, and in a way that would be, I like to think we'd build something without necessarily feeling like we need to give too much credibility and too much reference to them. We'd do it in a DIY sense, but I like to think it would then include them as opposed to be something that rises up in kind of opposition against them. I think that's it links.
I suppose I come at it from a very slightly different angle, in that we in Scottish Government have been listening to the most extraordinary conversations all around us and are very keen to join them without feeling as if we're dominating them. But we need to be able to understand what's being asked. And we need to understand how we do that without making it feel as if we're trying to take over, because the conversations that have happened in Scotland have come from the bottom up, and it's been hugely energising, but unless we can join that and understand and make sure that what's being asked for finds a landing.
Yeah, I think I echo that wholeheartedly in that I think the starting point I would have is that people have so many different identifications now and so many different ways of involving themselves in what they may or may not understand as politics, that it might be very interesting to explore how, as you say, some of those conversations and processes might be brought into interaction with each other, rather than trying to create a single process that brings everyone into line, if you like. And so such a process, if there was such a thing, could it potentially enrich could it potentially resource and enrich the bottom-up conversations in a way that could inform what the top-down is needing, if you like, what the top is needing in terms of it being enriched as well? And could there be some kind of interaction in that way between the top-down and the bottom-up? I mean, it may not be able to, such a thing may not be able to even begin with a singular process. It may need to begin with all sorts of different dynamics and ways of resourcing such a thing. So it might be that there might be some that are much more multimedia, some that are online, some that are very local, some that involve only a few people, some that involve hundreds of thousands of people. And then how do those things start to cross-fertilise and interact with each other?
I've heard one principle, which I'd like to run past you, and a couple of kind of ideas about what we need to do. The one principle was that this needs to include those in power, politicians, as well as citizens. And I thought that was quite interesting, and for me is quite important. It can't be exclusionary in either direction, and that seems to be a principle to guide us. And then a couple of ideas. One was that they then become part of the conduit up to others. So thinking about local politicians and local political structures as one of the kind of conduits. And I think that's quite interesting and important, and particularly if you're starting in a location, thinking about how you bring those politicians and leaders in seems to be quite important. I thought that was quite important. And then the second thing, just so, is then you also talk about kind of networking these conversations rather than trying to have one conversation that is trying to dominate everything, actually trying to find a way of networking the conversations. Those seem to be... I'm going to let you two, and then I'm going to just make sure that particularly Annie, who's writing furiously and doesn't lose her voice in the process of writing.
Just to follow on from that, maybe politicians may not be involved in all the conversations and in all the spaces because some of them are have very good reasons for perhaps not including them, and they wouldn't exist perhaps with them there.
Yeah. And just off the back of what you're saying, this might be stating the obvious, but I mean it's not really about systemic change, because in theory the process we have, or the systems we have in place, actually means that in theory, local politicians should be these conduits for bringing kind of the conversation up into spheres of decision making. But speaking from personal experience, it's just not happening at all. There's something about culture change needed. I know a few local politicians who do that fantastically. I know a lot who, not because they're bad people, but possibly because they lack the imagination or there's something. Don't get me started. It's not happening. And so it'd be interesting to know how that could happen. Yeah.
Annie, is there anything you want to say at this point? So just kind of focusing on that kind of... I'm trying to get actionable things and things that we can take away from this in particular, kind of either other ideas about how we can make this kind of visible kind of upwards without it being dominated by, as you've said, we hinted at this, there may be spaces where politicians wouldn't be welcome and shouldn't be welcome because they'll constrain the conversation or they'll be the wrong people. Other kind of ideas about how we kind of might make this visible, or other kind of principles that we might want to kind of guide whatever we do together.
On the issue of visibility, I haven't got a solution to to your question, but I think it's important to bear in mind that some parts of the conversation are already more visible than others. So some parts that are slightly outside the mainstream may need more resourcing than others in order to become more visible. I think it was as simple as that, really.
I think there's also something to think about sustainability as well. So I think you could have, the Scottish referendum was a fantastic example of democracy in action, and the votes at 16 element of that, 85% turnout, right? And young people also turning out to their first ever election to have a say on their country's future is incredible. But where I guess my question comes from is, when does that stop, and when does that bandwagon stop, and are we then driving forward into 2015 elections and forget about the lessons that we've learnt through the Scottish referendum? So it's about visibility and sustainability for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah.
Interested to know what lessons you think we learned.
Interested to know what lessons you learned. Actually.
Well, we learned that you can't control these conversations. That for us, and we put out, there was a huge effort went into making sure that the conversations that were happening were informed. But nonetheless, many of them, so very many of them, started absolutely at grassroots. And I think one of the things we learned most was if you give people a really big question, they take it seriously. If you give them something that is a real bit of, my vote matters, because so very often those conversations actually don't matter. It's about having a real voice
And unless you're talking about something that means something to people, then I think you're less likely to have great energy. And the other thing we learned was it actually wasn't about politics. It was about issues. And that was extraordinarily energizing. People really cared about issues on all sides. The discussions were not party political in the main. They were around what change could look like and what it should look like. And again, it's back to people feeling they had an ability to influence something that was extraordinary.
So I'm just thinking about like how we artificially create that endpoint, because you're exactly right. Like dialogue and engagement has been happening for ages, and it doesn't normally do that because there isn't normally a massive referendum with phenomenally large consequences for everyone involved at the end of the process. So I don't know if there's something that we can, like, what's the end point of these dialogues? So, I mean, I actually, like lots of other people, only really kind of registered the referendum amazingly late. And so I don't really know the background of it as much as I'd like to, but my understanding is that it wasn't, I mean, the referendum itself was spurred very much from Scotland. They decided that they wanted to do that. Sorry? Sure, yeah. So I'm just wondering whether we can do something similar, whether local government or regions or whatever it is can create some kind of endpoint that doesn't necessarily need the kind of the support of Westminster. That's something that local structures make happen. And potentially you could have a referendum on devolution that didn't necessarily need kind of permission from Westminster, and then at the end of it, who knows where you'd be, kind of thing. But I can't. That's not quite the right idea. But is there something that we can do?
This is clarifying something in my head. So I'd imagined that this process would run through the election, that the election itself places such a ridiculous timeline on all of this that we can't possibly kind of construct something before the election, and that we need to. I'd been seeing what we were trying to create as something that was long-term and sustainable and running way past any political process, because this is about long-term change. So I'd seen the first 6 months of this as being quite an open kind of space where citizens would come and engage in a conversation about things that mattered to them. But the more conversation I've had, and this conversation has reinforced that, without something very specific and meaningful, not only are we not going to get citizens there, but actually it's also not going to be visible as a result. And yet, if you close it down too quick, the tension is there. The tension there is that if you close it down too quickly, you cut more people out than you bring in. And so the conversation about the connection between the kind of democracy conversation and people's real lives is one of the most critical elements of this. Because what is the real question that people are actually asking? The way I would express it would be it's a question about power and where power lies and who has responsibility, who is making decisions that affect people's lives. But I don't think a question around power is really going to fly. I mean, maybe the question about visibility is actually just about if we get the question right and enough people involved, then it becomes visible. So maybe this conversation is actually a conversation about what the right question is. But I don't feel I've got any insight into what it should be.
But nor should you, perhaps, because, as you say, if your biggest lesson is about the uncontrollability and the sort of non-linearity of these of the process that you've been part of, perhaps that should be taken as one of the major lessons for this as well, in that while there may be a constitutional question that some people may be interested in mobilising around, as you say, some of the questions that some of the issues and processes that people are already mobilising around are not directly that question, but are some of the other things that have gone up on the board, issues around, the economy or homelessness or whatever it may be. And some people just want a forum where they can meet other people who are concerned about, have just got a general feeling of anxiety and concern about the way the country is going and these sorts of issues, and maybe don't know what they really want to do about it yet. So while it might be good to have a spine going through it around a question that's going to be addressed through a kind of structured process, it may also be good to have a sort of set of spaces that are also being supported for people that are involved in other issues that may connect up at some point to that, or may not. And that they're in relation and in tension with each other, and that having that role of this process to kind of be that mediator, I think would be ambitious enough.
I suppose if you're looking for a point of change, the devolution of greater powers to Scotland can still deliver some point of change, because greater powers to Scotland, though it's not a zero-sum game, changes the ground constitutionally for the rest of the UK. As we've seen, the pressure of the West Lothian question and the pressure so does that mean devolution to the cities? Does that mean... there are things around that. The other big elephant in this room has to be the European issue. That surely is a catalyst for one heck of a discussion.
So, three really interesting points in no particular order. Power creates a closed shop, and that closed shop further excludes. So as we have systems of power, people don't feel they can take part in the conversation. And when they don't feel they can take part in the conversation, they don't, so they step out. It's the Russell Brand don't bother to vote. We have a fantastic idea. You just gave the power to people with power. Really clever. So that exclusion is an issue. And we shouldn't avoid it. We should deal with it. If you want me to get involved, I need to feel the energy and the intent of you and your conversation and your ideas and your group. It's not enough to be passive. I want to see some passion. I want to see some energy. I want to see some belief in what you're telling me. And if you believe it that strongly, it might wash off on me. And the third point is, how do we get this debate into the ordinary conversation? How does this become normative, if you like? So it happened in Scotland. I know the group over here talking about this, so specifically in terms of it happened in Scotland, but I heard other people talking about this as well. How do we make this a normal part of our conversation so people want to have conversations about constitutional issues or democratic reform? And that's a real challenge for me. So by this point, Simon has hopefully got his ideas together on where the board is going next, and we're going to look at the next session. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. We've either got 5 or 6, and it depends whether people rebel against my lumping together again. So let's start with whether it's 5 or 6. We've kind of got this cluster of kind of involving groups that often get missed out, and it's whether we want to, it could even end up with 7 rather than 6. So involving young people in democratic reform, not just votes at 16, so that kind of involving young people in the conversation. And then the kind of non-political community groups, how to get them involved, those who don't see themselves as political. I guess, and then the other one is involving marginalised groups in the debate. So the 3 people who proposed those, do you see those as working together, or would you prefer to split them out? I'm going to take. If silence, I'm going to take as assent for bringing all together. Okay, they can always split up. Okay, so the AV corner takes the groups that are often not engaged, and then what's the positive? Excuse me. What's the positive imperative for being involved? So at the moment, the imperative is all kind of negative. The way that we're framing it is all negative. So what's the positive imperative for being involved? And let's make that the booze corner. There's a positive reason for being involved. And then we've got this kind of connecting small groups to the 3 that I lumped together. So how to get small groups and meetings across the UK involved, how to develop neighbourhood structures and processes, and what would the process be that brought different groups and organisations, activists together who are already involved. So that kind of the conversations that are going on, some of which are going to be about the debate and some of which are going to be slightly separate, but kind of bringing them all together. And let's put them in the, what do you call that corner? The obscure dignitary corner. Can it work as a leaderless conversation? And who would the leaders be? And if we have that one in the lectern corner, and then in the centre, are you happy, Ed, to be webcast in the centre, which is holding the conversation outside London, finding the topics that people really want to talk about? So that will mean passing the microphone round and making sure then you'll be webcast and we're not boring the people who are all the floods of people watching us online.
I'm really interested in taking it out of London for probably the same reasons you are. How could it possibly be a national conversation if we're just talking to the same people in London the whole time? And I feel that there's probably more of a diversity of views outside of London. Maybe people in London feel slightly more empowered than the rest of the country, and there's that power imbalance needs to be recognised. And yeah.
I think you should. Yes, I was going to.
Because it's very interesting, and Simon, forgive me if I now sound critical, but you've written down taking it out of London. I wrote down on the piece of paper holding the conversation outside London, and there is a fundamental difference, and I think I think it betrays precisely the problem with the notion of starting the conversation in London and then taking it outside. I would argue, in England in itself, the conversation is happening in a much more vibrant way outside London, and it's almost that London needs to actually catch up with the conversation and not vice versa. That would be my point. But don't take that personally. I think it's just a useful point to make about how nationally conversations around democracy and so on get framed, that somehow actually this is where everything happens. Like if I can give you another little example, if we're a small group we can talk for a bit longer, can't we? But if I can give you another little example, last Friday Ed Miliband came up to Manchester to announce the Labour Party's package of devolutionary measures, etc., etc. And one of the things that he particularly called for was this notion of a kind of regional Senate. And it didn't really go down very well. And one of the questions that's around today is, well, why didn't that get any traction? Why aren't people interested in that? But actually, how do we allow people from outside London to influence that power? You're not moving the power, you're not changing the power, you're just trying to enable regional voices to influence the power which is held still. My argument would be, we don't care about a Senate of the regions. We actually want the power out. Do you see what I mean? With Scotland, with Greater Manchester, with Leeds, wherever it happens to be. So it's not about influencing the power within London, it's about taking the power out. That's not strictly on message, because we're supposed to be talking about the process and how you get this process outside London. But I think it's an important point to make that if you're going to get the process outside of London, you've got to start from assuming that actually the conversation is more vibrant outside London than it is in London. I think that's quite important.
I think it is, for me, it's exactly on what we're talking about, because it's about the framing. And before you took the mic from me, I was going to reflect on how that was what I'd written was totally wrong. And because actually, as you said to me before, just before we met now, the conversation is already happening in a way that it isn't. We've seen it in Scotland. It would be ridiculous to say taking the conversation out of London when it is actually happening in Scotland right now in a much more vibrant way. So I think that's absolutely right. And so there's a sense of actually, and what I betrayed in my in what I wrote down there, taking out of London, was my own sense of geography, and actually part of this is for organisation. There's an irony for organisations inside the kind of the M25 talking about kind of wanting to engage with the rest of the UK. Part of this actually is about being humble, I think. And acknowledging that we neither should control or even know what's going on, and part of it is about being open to what's happening outside.
So, there is a power base here in London. There is. You can't ignore that. It's not like if you want to influence something in Westminster, then it's here that it's actually happening. So that's the reality of it. And I think that what works for people outside of London is much more local. So it's almost like starting with local democracy and then thinking about national democracy, because people can get involved in what's happening in my area and my ward, but really it's so far away. National party politics, for most people, they really don't feel that there's anything over it. So one of the things that's happening in Leeds at the moment is there's a group of people talking about how do we change party politics for good? How do we disrupt party politics? Do we do that by putting up 33 independent, connected candidates at the next election? Is that one of the ways of doing it? Do we do that by hosting conversations in Asda in the car park and kind of talking to people about what they want and how they want it and disrupting what's already there? Or do we try and create a more positive alternative to that? And it's local, I think, that engages people in it in the first place.
We did a survey that says that 82% of the general public feel that the relationship between central and local is completely fundamentally flawed, and we've got to change that. That's 82%, and I think it tells you something about the national media that it feels like that hasn't really been picked up, that sense of discontent isn't there. 82% think the central-local relationship is broken. That's the phrase that we use. I can't remember the exact survey question. It was something like, do you think that? It's one of those strongly agree, neither agree, etc., etc. And the agrees and strongly agrees felt that something needs to change in the relationship between central and local government.
There is a sense also that we need to remember that London itself isn't homogeneous, and that there are large pockets of London themselves that may well be having this conversation that I'm totally unsighted in the way that it's happening in Leeds and happening in Manchester, and that this isn't actually about kind of holding the conversation outside London. It's actually about what we're really talking about actually is holding the conversation outside where people think and where power does lie, isn't it? And it is going into Hackney, and it's going into, we need to make sure that we aren't saying it's got to all be outside the M25. Actually, it's about where power isn't it?
What would be cool, right, this is vision stuff, but what would be really cool would be if you had a really good, strong question that you wanted to have a conversation around, like, I can't think right off the top of my head, but something about, like, what would the future, you'd have to really think about the language of this so it appealed to people, but what is the future democracy that we want? What does democracy mean to me? What would it look like? What should it look like? What could it look like? And you had 20 simultaneous conversations happening around the country on the same day, because you had 20 people in different places that were saying we're prepared to kind of work together to make this happen, but we'll do it in our way. We'll do it with our regional flavour, whatever that is. We'll find our own venue, but we'll do it on the same day so it actually happens. And that there was a connection between the events somehow, like a web link or something, so that events could see each other, that they were happening at the same day. And you had a system of kind of harvesting what came out of it in terms of, even if you did open space, actually, you did 20 open spaces, but all in different cities on the same day. I'm just wondering if that would catalyse something that meant that the conversation is just being had outside of London, but it's done together so that it has more power to it than just one thing or another. And the secret seems to be how you then let people know what's happened, how you work with the outcomes of that to say, this is what people are saying, to kind of, that would be a real secret for it, is the harvesting.
I worked in central government for 2 years with Hazel Blears when she was Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. And during that time, we had this idea of having a local democracy day. And we piloted it, I think, in about 4 or 5 places where on a particular day, it was a local democracy day. And we funded and we gave community organisations, the voluntary sector, local authorities, this complete freedom and space to do whatever they wanted to do on Local Democracy Day around that. And it was quite good. It fulfilled something of the purpose that you said. But I'm kind of linking this back to the conversation I had in the previous group where we were talking about what is it that really captures the public imagination. And if I'm honest, it didn't capture the public imagination. And if I'm doubly honest, I honestly don't know what element of this whole democratic reform debate in England in particular does capture the public imagination. Now, the reason I feel strongly around the North, if you see what I mean, actually then plays against having a national conversation. Because I think one of the reasons that Scotland had such a vibrant conversation was that it was about a crystal clear yes-no issue on independence. Now, of course, there were wonderful conversations about all kinds of things on the back of that, but at the end of the day, there was something that crystallised the conversation, and it was something very real and very important, and so on. And forgive me, because I'm not meaning to kind of criticise your question, but a question around, what do you think democracy should look like isn't going to do that. And this is why I get a bit parochial then, and I say we'll never have a national conversation about it. But if I was to say we're going to have a referendum on a federal North, okay, I wouldn't, again, perhaps the language needs to look at that, but what does that actually mean? But if we had an independence vote or a vote, on whether we want the whole of the north of England to have its own governance structure of some kind. We can describe what that is. I'd be far more persuaded that we'd have a meaningful conversation about it than a kind of nebulous national conversation about democracy. So, sorry, I've been going on for too long, but in order to go back to our kind of exam question, how do you get the conversation out of London, I do wonder whether there's actually a very clunky, practical, referendum-style question that isn't necessarily national that you have to put to people, and that will be different in different places.
Well, didn't they had a referendum question about a regional assembly in the northeast, and that kind of failed. Is that how would it be different this time if we ask the north, do you want devolution?
That is a very, very good question. I think what would be different. The evaluation that's been done on the northeast referendum, the academic evaluation, says that the principal, well, there are two reasons why it failed. One was it was a badly organised campaign. That was simple as that. They just didn't get a badly organised campaign in favour. But the main reason, the principal reason that the academic said was that there wasn't a package of powers on the table to make it a meaningful vote. Now, if you look what Osborne's offered to Manchester today, that is a meaningful package of powers, £22 billion plus a democratically elected mayor. You know, I think people are going to get out of bed in Manchester tomorrow morning and go, do you know what, I want to have a conversation about this because this feels important to me. And I think there won't be a referendum, but if there was a referendum for a Metro Mayor for Manchester, as is being proposed, I think people would go out and debate it and discuss it and vote for it. They are. There's no referendum. Yeah. But that was a city mayor. And again, the problem with the city mayors is that they were too small and they didn't have the package of powers.
I mean, I think you're right, but my fear about creating a referendum is that you don't have the authority to create a referendum. So where does the authority come for a referendum? And I wonder whether the first step, and thinking 6 months ahead, if you're thinking kind of in an iterative fashion, the first step has to be actually for involved to acknowledge that we're completely unsighted on what conversations are going on already, and that actually what we need to be doing is going and actually taking part in those conversations and helping make them visible where people want them to be made visible. And as a kind of active step for us, it needs to be much more about I think there will be some generation and trying to create spaces where people can do it, but actually much more acknowledging these things are going on already and what can we do in order to help get more people into those spaces, rather than saying, right, it's a total whiteboard, there's nothing going on, which I think is how we slightly arrogantly went into this. And actually, so I think that gives me a real sense of what we need to do, which is different to how I think we went and thought about this 2 or 3 weeks ago.
So, as we are not going to do any more group work, I suggest you draw the chairs together. It doesn't have to be a circle. It can be any shape you like. That's democracy. And we will just hear a bit of feedback from the people who are running groups and from Andy. Okay, so I'm going to, in a moment, I'm going to ask the people who proposed ideas, or each of the, someone from each of the groups, to just give a couple of thoughts about what was discussed. Don't forget, we will be writing up all of the flip charts, so you won't miss anything or lose anything. However, I thought before I did that, I'm going to ask Andy, who was bumblebeing around, to give us a bit more of his reflections. You see, the thing is that I'll start singing in a minute, and no one will like that. It's a threat I also use on my children. So I'm going to ask Andy to give us 3 thoughts from him, and then we can go round the groups and just hear a little bit from each of them.
Okay, thank you. Interesting, because those second conversations are quite different to the first, which was curious listening in on. I more or less resisted the temptation to poke my nose in and raise things, but there was a few times where I could have done. They seemed a lot calmer than the first round. Is that what everyone's tired, or is this... settling down, so and if we do a third one, you'll all be agreeing and it'll be, yeah, this is all great, this is easy. So what did I learn wandering around? 3 things I've drawn out, perhaps in a fairly random order because there was an awful lot, but these ones stuck out for me. So these are what I heard and the things that resonated most for me from the second section. First one is, how do we aggregate the conversations that we have? But going further than that, how do we aggregate those conversations so that they retain their authentic essence and we don't lose people's voices when we aggregate them up? Because a lot of this conversation was about having small conversations locally in different places with different groups. And they're going to have different voices, different words, different language. How do we retain that authenticity and protect it in the wider conversation? The second thing is a literal quote that someone said, people coalesce around ideas, not the person. And I then filled that in with some of the things that a few other groups were saying. And really that if we're thinking about leadership in a conversation, the leadership can be dynamic. What matters is that there is authenticity in the process. So it's not about figureheads and people, it's about authenticity. And that really comes back to the first point about the authentic essence of our voices. So actually leadership has to be able to reflect all of those voices as well. And the third one is, how do we do this? How do we actually start a conversation as massive as democratic reform? And the thing that came out was we start local and then we set sail and we grow. And there isn't a map. This is kind of like the pre-exploration days of we just have to trust that the land is over there somewhere. And in the middle there are dragons. Well, we know where the dragons are. They're in SW1, so that's probably safe. But we know there are dragons. We know there's a bit of land somewhere. We're kind of hoping there's some good stuff when we get there. But actually we have to have a lot of faith in the process. And again, it comes back to that authenticity in the process and authenticity in the leadership. So we need to lose our agendas and we need to lose the idea of having power over the process and controlling it. We have to be able to let go and say that we have power with the process.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. Now, I'm going to go through the sessions, and very briefly, I'd ask the people who are running them just to give a very quick reflection. If, Andy, you're okay to run the mic around.
I will do that.
So the first session in this corner, which was community organising and sharing stories, can I ask somebody to pick up on that conversation? Who was in it?
We just talked about some of the things that we knew had happened in different places. I won't go through them, they're on this piece of paper. And we were asking what works really well. It's like you said, how do you start? What do you do? And we said action builds energy that you can feed off, a bit like Occupy. It's got to build, you can't organise it, you can't sort it out. It needs to be creative, so not just talking, but lots of other artistic stuff as well. Needs to have a simple question, maybe even a yes-no question. We talked about the referendum, might help. Has to have a tangible outcome people can get behind. And it always helps if you have lots of cake.
This is very, very true. Okay, so over by the booze was democratic, not just constitutional reform. Who was there? Graham.
I can't remember it.
See, that's because you were in the booze corner.
I'll have to reflect on the 2 or 3 sessions because they came together, but there were some similarities. One was trying to get to issues that are everyday concerns, but then there was also a concern that isn't necessarily, the link to democratic reform isn't obvious necessarily. So there was a difficulty about how you link everyday concerns to democratic imagination. And that riffed into the second session where there was this question about, can you really have a conversation, which I think we really need to think about democratic reform and democratic imagination. Do people respond to potential programs rather than a kind of more general questioning? And perhaps do we actually have to create, as part of this public conversation, quite structured opportunities for dialogue, like, sort of mini-publics or others, which can be part of that process, but which can spark other things happening. The other thing was the importance of framing and trying to frame this positively, and it's quite difficult because very often framing has become quite negative. And someone else will pick that up in a minute. And the other thing was in a couple of groups, the inequality was returned to a couple of times, and I think that's quite an interesting way, potentially an interesting way in, but how to do that with positive energy rather than negative, I think, is a really interesting question.
Okay, thank you very much. And then over at the back, Transport Control Protocol, Internet Protocol for Participation Projects.
We talked about two things. So I think one of the things we talked about, and it was very general, was the idea that with participation there are lots of different touch points, and it would be really nice if we could build like a recommendation engine, so that if you're involved in one type of participation, then there's a recommendation that you might be interested in a different forum where you could take part. So I'm going to build that this weekend.
Excellent.
No, I'm serious.
No.
And then we also talked a bit more closely to the question about the link between improving participation and, in particular, democratic reform. So the sort of the geeky versus the real life, and which way we should build in order to join these two things together.
Very good. Very good. Thank you very much.
Can I just take control of the microphone for a minute? Because one thing I wanted to say is he had TCP/IP in there, which is very geeky and techie. But as a techie geek at heart, who may have shifted slightly, I was just thinking about carbon-based conversational protocol.
Well, I was thinking more about be promiscuous in what you accept and rigorous in what you send, which is the key principle of Transport Control Protocol. Anyway, moving on. Moving on. Simon, how do we make the conversation visible?
I nominate Annie.
Annie?
Yes, we're talking about how to make the conversation visible, but also how to be a bit stronger than that, to hold policymakers to account as well. And there were sort of 3 points really that I've written down. One of them was that we were talking about involving people who are in power in those conversations in some way. So not all the time. There'll be some conversations that we need to have without them. And we also have an interesting voice from government as well, saying we're interested in engaging, but we don't know how to do that without dominating those conversations. So how to sort of link up the top down and bottom up. We talked about linking horizontally as well, things being like groups having conversations and how they can be visible to each other, as well as just making sure that the bottom-up conversations are visible to the people in power. But I think most of the conversation was around how we create some kind of crux endpoint for this to move toward. So obviously with Scotland, there was just such a clear endpoint. There was a massive decision and people's voices really were heard. How can we imitate that in some way? Do we need a specific policy that we're building momentum around? Do we need some kind of event? So that was, we didn't have the answer to that.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's interesting. So the thing about politicians and involving them in the conversation came up in a few of the things I heard.
Yeah. Yes, and I think there's
inclusivity.
There's a whole question about how you do that, and we can come back to that. So people power in the NHS and linking it to real stuff, which was the conversation over by the obscure dignitary.
Summarise very briefly. People care about different things. Different people care about different things. So the starting point for the debate will be different depending on who you're talking to. Sort of obvious. So you can talk about what people care about, and then you can ask them what changes they want to see, and then you can ask what changes, power structures, governance, etc., are needed in order to affect the changes they want to see. So, very simple point. You can start with where people are and the concerns they have, and then move towards constitutional questions. What structures are needed to make these changes? Who do you trust to make the changes? Pointed out that actually even this may be difficult because people are very cynical about any kind of conversation about change. But this would not be a consultation. This would be something that's organised by. We didn't quite decide. But it would not be organised by. It wouldn't be a top-down conversation.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, into the second session now. Who would like to talk about small groups, neighbourhood structures, and different groups and organisations and activists? Behind you, Andy.
Thanks. So yes, this was about getting the different community groups together, the networks, the structures, how to link these things. And I think the word of this discussion, although I don't think it was actually mentioned, is probably balance. How to actually do this, how to balance the one conversation with the multiple conversations, because it has to be multiple conversations, how to bring different groups together, how to balance the near-term objectives, the objectives of, just sending stuff out there and getting people to talk about it, with perhaps longer-term objectives, which might be getting stuff back from those people. So hearing what they've been talking about. The how to balance the online discussions with the face-to-face discussions, some of the practicalities, how to balance a wider framework and just something that's sort of sending out information with bringing it back and linking people up with other people. So there were lots of different discussions. We definitely didn't come to one conclusion of this is the way to do it. We didn't even come close to this. We're probably 2 or 3% through that discussion. But it was a good start.
But it's a good start. Thank you very much. So involving young people, non-political community groups and marginalised groups. Who'd like to talk about that? Nominating Tiffany. It's like University Challenge, isn't it?
Paper. I'm not going to read them all, don't worry. Basically, we were looking at involving marginalised groups, young people, non-political groups. How do we get them involved in political discussions and things that are relevant to them? First of all, we need to know who are these hard-to-reach groups, what are they interested in, what levels do they want to take part, and basically what is really meaningful to them, because people are going to be involved in projects that they find meaningful and that they want to be involved in. So young people, for example, sorry, that's just the work that we do, may not know everything about the Labour Party or whatever, but they want education, so they'll be involved in a project at educational level, so something where they can see tangible change. It's about empowering them, giving them ownership of projects so that they know that they're a part of something and they are making a difference. Starting the idea of localism came up, so starting small scale where they can see change practically taking place with that they're actively involved in, rather than kind of a big national scale project where they may not see an outcome from it. Also, why are these groups perhaps disengaged? What are the barriers that they face in getting involved in political discussions, political reform, and looking at things in creating spaces where they can be heard as a community, as a group, as groups of people. We need to listen to them in the right places. So how are they expressing their views? We may not just be listening in the right ways. So are they using social media? Let's go out there and use social media. Listen to what they're saying on social media. Is it in their youth centre where they have a soccer club every week? Let's go there. Is it in their religious centres? We need to go to where they are speaking about what's important to them. Importance of media and developing confidence. And I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And then, what's the positive impetus for involvement?
Thank you. So the positive impetus, because there's a general disillusionment, disengagement, and so on. We strayed a bit into what would be the positive impetus for people getting involved in politics as we have it, rather than getting involved in this conversation about democratic reform. So we spent a little bit of time on that. We wondered if the question is the wrong question, because are people really interested in this thing, democratic reform? Isn't it vision that's going to inspire people, and a vision for a fairer, juster, more just society? And maybe that's the conversation we need to have. And then what kind of how do we make that happen? And then we talked a little bit about some of those really positive things that have come after crises, after war, or after Iceland's economic meltdown. And maybe it's got to get worse before people will really get involved.
Okay.
Sorry.
The worse, the better is first Lenin's slogan that we've had for this session so far.
Did Lenin talk about Iceland?
Sorry?
Did Lenin talk about
No, he
Iceland?
said the worse the better before, to foment revolution. So, holding the conversation outside London, places like Harrow, you know, that sort of thing.
So who in this room lives outside Zone 2? Here's...
Yeah, I live in the Independent Republic of Manchester, as from this morning. No, we wrote down, accidentally, in the middle of our piece of paper, taking the conversation outside London. And that, I think, for us, betrayed precisely the fundamental problem with this debate. And so two issues with it. First of all, to recognise that power within London is incredibly unevenly distributed, and so there are democratic issues within London itself. But secondly, and probably more importantly in terms of what we're trying to get at with the question, is that actually, in some of our experience, the most vibrant conversation is taking place outside London in the first place. And it's how does this conversation, which happens this evening to be in London, how does this conversation catch up with the conversation elsewhere in England, let alone Scotland, which is more obvious. So that's when we moved into another question, which is, do we need some kind of crunchy issue or topic or question that will galvanise? And I think that's the theme that seems to have come up in a lot of groups in order to get the kind of traction that perhaps we're talking about. And then if we do need some kind of crunchy question, does that actually need to be a different question in different places? Does the key driving question around democratic reform need to be a local or a regional or a sub-regional question of some kind? And does it need to be then of a referendum nature, yes, no, or whatever? So we didn't really come to an answer that. The third thing just to flag is that a question was asked about, well, what is the role of local government in this? And the extent to which disenfranchised local councillors could be big allies, so to speak, within the process, or whether, as ultimately tribal politicians, they might not be. So that was another question that was answered.
Okay, fantastic. And the last group to come to?
I just like the idea of councillors as the cannon fodder of mediocrity.
Yes. Interesting one. I'm not sure whether they're being fired out of the cannon or whether they're being fired at.
I know what I would do.
Can it work as a leaderless conversation? Who was that? Down there at the end.
There are no
leaders.
leaders.
All of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, the leader.
I prefer the term facilitator. So the reason I put this up there was because of the phrase leaderless revolution, which was very prevalent in the Arab Spring, for want of a better way to characterise it, and the fact that a lot of people felt betrayed because the revolution itself didn't have a leader, but once you'd achieved your initial goal of overthrowing an unpopular dictator, leaders came forward, and they tended to be older leaders than the revolutionists. They tended to be people from established political parties, though moribund or outlawed previously. And I think that led someone in the group to highlight the fact that actually it is a lot easier to have a leaderless conversation or a leaderless revolution when it's clear what you're against. And that seems to be something that's quite relevant. And that actually when you try to move into what are you for, something that we discussed in the previous group that I was involved in, there are so many different options that one leader struggles to corral those together, because actually, again, somebody said that the role of a leader is to kind of e pluribus unum, to make from many one, to have a sort of a sense of agenda out of lots of different possibilities. And that's quite difficult with some of the things that we're talking about, because unless you crystallize it around a particular area, like devolution, you might be able to get some sort of regional or local leaders to champion that. If it's more proportional electoral system, you might be able to get smaller parties to champion that. But if you're talking about something as diffuse as democratic reform, maybe that's too abstract. And that perhaps we do need, and this goes back to something that was said previously, more issue-based leaders to raise their issue in the public consciousness. They're not political leaders, but they're people who can sort of help to crystallize a problem that we face as a society, and then they can help trace back on their particular issue to some of the underlying structural or political reasons why that is an issue, and that some of those might end up converging around concerns about democratic participation or equality. And slightly Leninist, we did also talk about the role of a sort of vanguard, a vanguard party, a vanguard individual, a vanguard set of organisations. And I think towards the end of our discussion, we did question whether actually that possibly the best vanguard for that is a set of civil society or civic society organisations who have enough of a common agenda, not a single-minded groupthink, but enough of a common agenda, as happened arguably in Scotland with groups like Commonweal and others who were independent groups, and they each had their issues, whether it was a feminist approach or an environmental approach or an economic approach, but they could see that the independence debate allowed them a common voice for some of their demands for control to be focused in Scotland. So whether actually that vanguard is a sort of civil society one, and whether the leadership can be shared, but it's present enough in a sort of vanguard group.
Thank you very much. Okay, so those are all the discussions. Now, obviously, the question is, what is to be done? And thank you very much. I was very proud of that. So I'm going to ask Andy to sum up his last couple of thoughts, and then I want to ask you to do one thing before you go. And we can carry on the conversation afterwards, but I want Andy to...
Oh, you're going to ask that? Okay. Yeah, that's actually quite hard to sum up, because that's fantastic, actually. I'm going to start my summing up by pointing out something that's probably really obvious, that I haven't got a clue what the answer is. And it actually comes down to this point of, if we learn from the Arab Spring, if you create a revolution too quickly without knowing where you're going, you simply create a void. And into that void leaps the cannon fodder of existing politics that have been held back. So actually, rapid change is really dangerous if you don't know where you're going, and your common purpose is around one issue that once you've created the change has gone away. So I like the idea of a collective shared responsibility. I think this conversation is everyone's conversation. So we need people from all sides, and that comes back to the point that was made in a few groups about this isn't us and them. This isn't a London versus Manchester conversation. It might be a little part of SW1 versus the rest of us conversation sometimes, but even some of those people in SW1 need to be in the conversation, or they need to get out of the way. But I think there are models out there, so we look at what works and what doesn't work. Things like Occupy. Occupy is really good at creating noise. It's really bad at creating change. Why? Because it doesn't take the next step of saying, people are really fed up, people are really angry. Could we do this? And then engaging the people that can make the change happen. So for this conversation to work, we have to engage not just with people who are fed up, but with people who can make change happen. And that's really hard to do. We have to hold the conversation of 60-odd million people, because that's who it affects. And that's really hard to do. And we don't have a model for doing that. There are not a lot of examples of really successful large-scale dialogues around. And if anyone thinks the internet is going to fix the problem, it ain't. Because there are no examples of large-scale online dialogues that work, for the very simple reason that they don't. There are lots of examples of smaller-scale dialogues, and we need to think about models of aggregation. But that comes back to the point that I picked up earlier about authenticity. So how do we create authenticity in the conversation? And this is the reason that we've convened today, is a lot of us have got a feeling that something's not right. There are an awful lot of people as well, usually within not too far distance of here, who think they've got the answer and are only too willing to tell us. Anyone who tells you they've got the answer to this, shoot them. Shoot them quickly. Put them and us out of our misery, because they haven't. Because they might have a little part of it, they might have some good ideas, but they don't have the answer. Collectively, we possibly do. So how do we facilitate that conversation? Local. Start local. Start where the conversations are. Start where people are already talking, even if they're talking about something different. You know, I heard someone say, well, what do we mean by politics? And this is that old question. Health and education, roads, rubbish, dog shit. That's politics? Yeah, actually it is. It affects your life. When we talk about the party politics, we really mean economics. Because politics is now about money. And we've got to get away from that. We've got to get back to politics is about me and my life and what it means to my children and my future, my grandchildren. Where are we going with it? It means having conversations. Politics is about conversation. So any way you can have a conversation, you can talk about politics. Just don't call it that. And I think the thing I've got out of today, most of all, is there's a real chance to create thousands of completely different conversations right across the country. What we need to figure out is what the questions are, because we don't know, how we connect those conversations and share them, because we don't know, and then what we do with it, because our politicians need to know. We need to tell them.
Okay, thank you very much, Andy. That's fantastic. So, we've run a little over, for which apologies. I wanted to ask you to do one thing, but before I do, I'm going to thank Graham, our very generous host here at a very generous host here at the University of Westminster for this fantastic space, and Susie and the rest of my team and Involve and Democratise's teams for setting all of this up. So thank you very much to them. Thank you to you for coming. But this is the start of a conversation. It's about developing the space. So I would like you to say if you would like to be part of continuing to develop the space. And if you would like to be part of continuing to develop the space, please go over to that board in a moment and write up your email address. Don't write up your email address if you want to be kept informed. We own you. We have all your email addresses. Write up your email address if you want to make a commitment to actually do something as part of this group and part of a continuation of conversations, whether it's local or whether it's national, whether it's answering some of those questions that Andy posed so well at the end. Write up there, and we will be in touch very soon to work out where we can go next with this. And if you don't want to, because you're too busy, because you have a life to lead, that's fair enough. But we will keep you informed, and we'll write up all of these things and get them out to you. And hopefully, even if you aren't able to commit any time, you'll certainly be able to commit your attention. So thank you very much for coming.